All right, so, we love it when you guys send us stuff that just really, gets the wheels turning.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
this one you sent over, the Guardian article, how the roots of the PayPal mafia extend to apartheid South Africa. Like, whoa,
it's a
okay.
fascinating one for sure.
Yeah, and, thinking about Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, like two of the biggest names in tech right now, and their connections back to this really specific, really, charged period in South African history, like apartheid. Just
People are probably trying to figure out, does their upbringing in that kind of environment, does it give us any clues about like why they have some of the views they have now?
yeah.
Like with Musk and some of the things he's been, promoting lately, and
Yeah, like getting into more and more like far right stuff, it seems like.
exactly, and Thiel too. There's that whole thing about him allegedly defending apartheid in the past.
Yeah.
So it's not about saying like, oh, this caused that. It's more like, okay, let's look at the soil they grew up in.
Yeah.
What were the ideas floating around back then, and how might that have shaped their thinking?
Yeah, totally. So I guess first things first, for anyone who's not like super familiar with this whole PayPal mafia thing, can you like give us a quick rundown of like who we're even talking about here?
Sure. So basically, you had this group of people, mostly founders and early employees at PayPal,
Mm-hmm.
and then they go on to start or invest in like a ton of other huge tech companies.
But a lot of them are billionaires now, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. They've become
Mm.
super influential, not just in Silicon Valley, but U.S. politics too.
Yeah.
It's interesting how that's been growing.
Yeah, for sure. And what's crazy for our deep dive today is that a bunch of these guys actually have roots in, white ruled South Africa.
Right.
Which is just wild to think about. Like
It definitely adds another dimension to things.
it really does. So the article like specifically mentions, obviously Elon Musk with him owning X now and, being all buddy buddy with Trump. At one point, Trump even like wanted to give him a government job, like focused on efficiency or something. And then, of course, there's Peter Thiel, venture capitalist, also a PayPal co-founder. And then David Sachs, another PayPal guy, big time fundraiser now. But he was actually born in Cape Town.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And then there's Roloff Botha, whose grandfather, Pik Botha, was the last foreign minister of apartheid South Africa. So
Yeah, you can't really get much closer than that, can you?
talk about a family connection, right? So the article really hones in on Musk and Thiel. And like the question it asks is like, does their experience growing up in apartheid South Africa, like, does that offer any insight into like where they're at politically now? What really stood out to you about like Musk's early life in the context of all this?
Well, the article talks about how South African society back then was, extremely racially segregated, and that being a white male meant you were automatically at the top of the hierarchy.
Right.
All these advantages built in.
Right.
So it makes you wonder if that kind of upbringing, like, did it have any influence on him, like leaning more and more to the far right as he's gotten older?
Yeah, because there's a lot there, right? Like him supporting Germany's AfD party, his whole thing with genetics, and then him, backing these white genocide claims in South Africa, and even pushing the Great Replacement theory.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, and it does seem at odds with, the kind of image we often have of the tech world as being more progressive and inclusive.
Exactly. Yeah. So like, how do we reconcile those two things?
Well, and it's important to remember what that South African writer Johnny Steinberg said about how you can't always just draw a straight line from childhood experiences to adult beliefs,
Right.
But having said that, when you start digging into Musk's family history, you find some pretty interesting and I got to say kind of disturbing details.
Yeah, for sure. Like his maternal grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, that guy seems like a really key figure. He apparently moved from Canada to South Africa specifically because he was a supporter of the apartheid government.
Wow.
And even before that, he was involved with this movement in Canada called Technocracy Incorporated, which the article described as having some, fascist tendencies, like they had uniforms and salutes and stuff.
That's interesting. And, the fact that Technocracy Incorporated was actually banned in Canada during World War II because against fighting Hitler.
Whoa.
And Haldeman himself was in prison for his stance. And then after the war, he gets out and starts promoting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, classic anti-Semitic text.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And then eventually he ends up in South Africa, aligning himself with the National Party and their whole Christian nationalism thing. So
yeah, you see a potential thread there, right? Like a family history that's really engaged with these ideologies that prioritize, a certain kind of societal control.
Yeah.
And maybe that resonates in a very different and much more evolved way with some of the hierarchical and potentially exclusionary views we see expressed today.
yeah, it's a lot to think about for sure. And then you have Elon's father, Elon Musk, who the article says initially claimed to be against apartheid, but then later seemed to favor this idea of like a gradual reform with separate parliaments, which is kind of like apartheid light,
He did slower transition.
Yeah, and he even said that Elon's maternal grandparents were like super pro-apartheid and even had some sympathy for Hitler, so.
So you've got this family environment where these pretty extreme ideologies are present and being discussed openly.
Right. And then if you zoom out to the wider context of South Africa in the 1980s when Musk was growing up, it was a time of like massive social and political upheaval. So to
Absolutely.
speak.
There were huge rebellions in the black townships, which
Yeah.
led the government to declare a state of emergency, and they were cracking down hard.
Yeah, and the article talks about white flight and the rise of these neo-Nazi groups like the AWB. So it's like all this stuff is happening around him as he's growing up.
Exactly. And his family is immersed in these ideologies ranging from, technocratic control to outright fascism and racial supremacy.
Right.
So I think it's valuable to consider both the family influences and the broader societal context to try and understand the world he was navigating during those formative years.
Definitely. And it's crazy to think that he was actually born in 1971 during the time when John Vorster was prime minister. And Vorster himself had been a general in the Ossawa Brandwag, which was this fascist militia that was aligned with Hitler during World War II.
Yeah, not exactly a neutral historical figure.
And the article even quotes Vorster comparing his own version of Christian nationalism to Nazism. So it's like there's this very direct link to some of the most,
Yeah.
horrific ideologies of the 20th century.
And it's important to understand that the Ossawa Brandwag were really vehemently opposed to South Africa joining the war against Hitler. They were even plotting with German intelligence,
Yeah.
And Vorster himself was interned during the war because he was a known Nazi sympathizer.
Yeah, so these connections were pretty serious. And then after the war, the OB basically got absorbed into the National Party, the same party that implemented apartheid in 1948. So yeah, the political landscape during Musk's childhood was very much shaped by people with these, direct ties to fascist and Nazi ideology.
And their brand of Christian nationalism was specifically focused on Afrikaner nationalism, using a particular interpretation of Christianity to justify racial segregation and white supremacy.
Okay, so let's talk about Peter Thiel for a bit, because his upbringing in Southern Africa in the 1970s also seems super relevant. Like the article mentions him growing up in a city where people were still openly praising Hitler, which is just insane to think about.
It is pretty shocking, right? And it speaks to the fact that those ideologies were still very much alive in that region, even decades after World War II.
Right, and the article also brings up this claim from his biography, The Contrarian, that when he was a student at Stanford, he actually defended apartheid, saying it was economically sound.
Yeah. And while he's reportedly denied directly supporting apartheid, that statement, along with, his criticisms of welfare programs and even women voting, it does make you think about what his fundamental values and perspectives might be.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's the whole Swakopmund thing. He spent some time in this town in what was then Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And the article describes it as a place that was still really into Nazism in the 1970s. Like people were still saying Heil Hitler, and there was Nazi memorabilia everywhere.
It's really hard to grasp how that could even be a thing decades after the Holocaust.
Right. And Thiel's, he comes from a German family and he went to a German language school there while his dad was working at a uranium mine. So it's like, it's hard to imagine that environment didn't have some impact on him.
It had to, right. And he's actually said that his schooling in Swakopmund made him dislike regimentation, which he says led him to libertarianism. But if you think about the extreme racial inequality that was just built into that society, especially in the mining industry where his dad worked, black laborers had terrible conditions and were paid next to nothing, while the white managers lived these lives of luxury.
It was a totally different reality.
And it was completely normalized. So did Thiel, even as a young kid, was he aware of this huge disparity? And if so, how did that shape his later views on things like economic systems or social welfare?
Well, the article doesn't really get into that specifically, but it's hard to imagine he wasn't aware of it, right? Like it was so in your face.
Yeah, it was impossible to miss. So I guess that brings us to this whole question of white privilege and what the dominant perspectives were within apartheid in South Africa. The article talks about how the education system, the Christian nationalist education system, they really tried to portray Afrikaners as victims to justify apartheid.
It's like rewriting history to fit their narrative.
Exactly. And there's this quote from Bear Roberts, who grew up in a family that supported apartheid, but she later came to oppose it. And she talks about how strong this narrative of Afrikaner victimhood was. This idea that they had suffered these historical injustices, and therefore they needed to take these, what they considered extreme measures to rebuild their nation and protect their culture.
It's like a justification for anything.
Yeah, it became a way to legitimize the discrimination and oppression of apartheid in the minds of many white South Africans.
And even within the white population, there were different shades of opinion, right? Like the article talks about how schools were segregated, and while both Afrikaners and English-speaking schools benefited from apartheid, their views on it weren't exactly the same.
Interesting.
Yeah, like Philip van Niekerk, who went to an English-speaking school. He remembers that while people generally didn't like the National Party government, there was still this deep-seated sense of white superiority, you know?
It's like even those who might have spoken out against apartheid still benefited from it and didn't really do much to change it.
Right, and there's this British documentary from 1968 that shows this hypocrisy among the English-speaking industrialists in Johannesburg. They presented themselves as liberal, but they were making a ton of money off the backs of black workers.
Yeah, Helen Suzman called them out for their inaction, and Stanley Cohen, who's the managing director of OK Bazaars, this big chain of stores, he even admitted that they only hired white people to work the counters because they were catering to racist prejudices.
Wow, so this complicity ran really deep. So when we see some of these debates happening today about privilege and power dynamics in the tech industry, it's helpful to keep this historical context in mind. You know, this idea of ingrained superiority, even if it's subconscious, it can be a really powerful lens to view things through, even if it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
So the article then moves on to the 1980s and how the apartheid regime was becoming more and more unstable, you know, with the Soweto uprising and the government's brutal response to it. And it mentions the rise of the white genocide conspiracy theory and this neo-Nazi group, the AWB, with their swastika-like emblem and their open admiration for Hitler.
Yeah, the growth of those extremist groups really reflects the fear and anxiety that the white minority was feeling as apartheid started to crumble.
Like they were clinging to power.
Exactly. And figures like Eugene Terre-Blanche and the EWB, they represent this desperate attempt to hold on to the old order, you know.
And B. Roberts, she makes this really interesting point that even for privileged white people who were living in their bubble, it was getting harder and harder to ignore the reality of what was happening to Black South Africans. Like the injustices were just too big to ignore.
They were impossible to deny.
Right. And then finally, the article mentions that Musk left South Africa in 1988 before the official end of apartheid, and that he avoided the mandatory military service.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it ends with this really powerful statement from Philip van Niekerk, who said that all white South Africans who grew up under apartheid, whether they realized it or not, internalized this sense of being the master race.
Wow, that's heavy.
Yeah, and that's maybe one of the most lasting and insidious legacies of apartheid. You know, the way it shaped the perspectives and worldviews of people who grew up under it, regardless of what they believed individually.
And those influences can be really subtle and hard to pinpoint,
Yeah.
but they're definitely there.
So yeah, we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's clear that the early lives of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel were shaped by apartheid in South Africa in really complex ways. And understanding this historical context gives us another way to think about their views and actions, even though, you know, as we've talked about, it's not a simple cause and effect thing.
Yeah, it's much more nuanced than that.
Right. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the things about their formative years that really stood out to you? And does this information change how you view these two guys at all?
That's a great question.
Yeah. And, you know, this is a really multifaceted and challenging topic, and there are definitely no easy answers here. We really encourage you to keep digging into the history of apartheid and its impact, because it's something that still resonates today in so many ways.
Couldn't agree more.
So that's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time on Spotlight Chronicles.
See you then.